Blah, blah. Hello everybody and welcome to our economics induction lesson. This lesson sits alongside our guide to our economics course, which you can find on the South Hunsley School Sixth Form website. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at that. Today we are going to do a range of different activities which I hope will give you a flavour of the sorts of things that we would look at in a normal economics lesson. Now obviously in a normal economics lesson we would pick one element of the following content and study that in more detail, and this is much more of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully in doing so you'll get an idea whether or not this is the subject for you. Hopefully you are watching this as a normal slideshow, full screen. There are some elements of it where I'm going to ask you to minimize the slideshow. There's a small video in this that you'll need to click on YouTube to watch. If any of the instructions themselves aren't clear, then hopefully you'll be able to figure out yourself what it is that you need to be doing at those times. And if at any point you have any questions, you should contact either myself, Mr. Gray, or Mr. Stannard here at South Hunsley School. My email address is barry.gray, gray with an A, at southhunsley.org.uk. Okay, let's make a start. Here's what we're going to do first off. We would always do this in our economics induction class. I'm going to ask you to tell me the names of as many of the following characters as you can. I'm going to leave a little pause so you won't need to pause the presentation yourself as we go through this activity. All I'd like you to do, please, is write down any of the names of the following people that you recognise. There are going to be 13 of them. So you should write down numbers 1 to 13 on your page, and then you'll be well prepared for this activity. Let me give you a few moments just to do that. Okay, so you should have numbers 1 to 13. We will make a start. Number 1 is a difficult one. There's 2 that are difficult, and number 1's definitely difficult. So don't be disheartened if you don't get this first one. Not very many economics students do at the start of the course. Here is the first one though. You will have seen him at some point growing up, especially maybe around your birthday or Christmas. If you think you know who that is, write his name down now. Okay, let's have a look at number 2. The jacket that he's wearing, you probably wouldn't wear that anymore, but you may still recognise him from your younger days. Number 3 is a TV presenter that you might recognise. 2019, published a new children's book. You're probably a little bit too old for it. I'm giving you a little bit of help with number 4. Some of you wouldn't have needed it at all. Some of you it may come in handy. Who do you think number 4 is? Now that's our first 4 out of 13. Some of you might be sat there with none at all. And if that's the case, then try not to worry too much. Economics might still be the right place for you. I'm going to do a few more in a moment and hopefully you'll get some of them. If you've got a couple that you're reasonably confident about, then I think that you're already definitely well on the way to becoming a young economist. Let's start with our next row. Here comes number 5. I'm almost certain you're going to recognise this young person. There we are. I told you would get that one. Still clinging on to power at the moment. We'll see what happens over the next couple of months as we're expecting a new president to be sworn in January. Here comes the next one. Little bit of a clue here. If you got the last one, well, this person is related to that person. So, if you think you know who that is, write her name down now. Okay, next one is a local person, somebody that we would recognise from our city. Not as prevalent as it used to be. Famous for coming into a close contact with an egg. If you think you know who this is, write his name down now. Okay, number 8 is on his way. This is the other one that students don't tend to get early on. By the end of your economics course, you're definitely going to know who this gentleman is. If you know who he is already, put his name down now. Number 9's a popular one. Number 9's on his way now. This young man, I keep saying young, don't I? This gentleman, he's relatively senior now. In his more senior years, his role that we would recognise is quite different to what he did a good few years ago. And I'm not too worried whether or not you can spell his name right. There's a bonus point if you do. Who's this gentleman? Okay, and last 4 to come. Next one, on TV quite a bit at the moment. You might recognise him. If you know who this is, put his name down now. Number 11's coming up next. Very close to Halloween. I think this person's got a mask on. Try not to be too scared if you know who this is. Write their name down now. Okay, let's not stay on that one too long. That is a scary image. Next one. This gentleman in the centre. Famous film from 2019. And last but not least, somebody from the world of sports. See if you recognise this final person. Okay, let's go through these. You're going to have to self-assess these. I can't help you with that. Get your different coloured pen out and you can start ticking or crossing for the names that you've got. Let's go through them. So, first off, in the top left, we have got Adam Smith, founding father of what we think of as modern economics, published his book On the Wealth of Nations. It's actually got a much longer title, but abbreviated to the Wealth of Nations in 1776. If any of you have got that, economics is definitely your subject. Number 2 is Football Manager. Arsenal manager for a long, long time. Managed the team in their Invincibles year. Okay, so next up, what I want to do is have a quick look at the sorts of things that you might do with your economics qualification once you're done. So, what happens after university? Taken from the website whystudyeconomics.ac.uk of a sample of economics graduates. These are the sorts of jobs that people who did economics at university went on to do. You can see the largest proportion there by far is business and financial. That's a very broad explanation, but around about 50% of people who study economics, that's what they went on to do. Other jobs, again, is very vague, and it's the next biggest chunk, but it gives you some idea of the breadth of the things that you might do if you study economics. Next up, people join the commercial, the industrial and public sector quite often as managers or trainee managers in their early career days. A number of people went on to study for a further degree. A number of people weren't able to give a response, maybe because they've gone off travelling, maybe because they're doing something else with their time at that point there. Clerical and secretarial jobs for a number of graduates as they work their way into longer careers, and finally numerical clerks and cashiers. So we have a real range there, okay? And you've got some others. People moved on to work in IT, technical jobs, marketing, education, engineering and legal areas. So that's some idea of where your economics qualification might take you. Now, next thing I want to draw your attention to, and a few people mentioned this in the video, you may have even written it down yourself. A relatively recent study by the BBC, working with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, looked at what it was that graduates could expect to earn 5 years after graduating based on the degree that they did. And you can see there's a whole range of degrees there that you may be looking at. Some of them will link very closely to other subjects that you may be doing at A-level. At the top, in terms of the amount that people were likely to be earning 5 years after graduating, sits medicine and dentistry. You start on a relatively high wage in those careers. Let's be honest, you've been at university a lot longer than anyone else. So you need that higher salary earlier on in your career to make up for that. Next up though, we've got economics. Economics graduates, they tend to be relatively well paid compared to other graduates. And the reasons for this reflect the fact of the skills that economics as a subject requires you to have. Economics has a few main skills you should be familiar with. So we look at the key skill first off of knowledge and application. Knowing what different economic terms means, understanding the world around you, having an idea of who some of the people were in those pictures and what it is that they do that affects our day-to-day lives. Some element of learning, storing that stuff in your brain is the knowledge and the examples part of economics. The second part is analysis. That's being able to explain how you know what it is that you know, being able to put into words the things that you know so that somebody else would understand them. One of the greatest challenges I always put to my class is, can you give me an explanation for this technical, this difficult concept that one of our year 7s would understand, that would mean that they had a grasp of what it was we were discussing. If you can do that well, you'll do well in economics. That's the skill of analysis. And the final one is evaluation. Every day, you, I, people in this school, politicians all over the world, people in employment, people running hospitals, people working in large businesses are making decisions. And those decisions are based on a judgment. And the judgment will be usually a weighing up of different sides, different points of view. And for us in economics, that skill is evaluation. It's not often that you're going to be asked your outright opinion on things in economics. It's more often you'll be asked to present the two different views that people might have and then try and make some judgment yourself about which view might be most effective in different situations. If you are good at evaluation, if you're good at analysis, and you've got the knowledge and qualification to underpin those skills, you'll do really well at economics. And if you do well at economics, longer term, you're likely to be well paid in a salary, if that's the sort of thing that's important to you. Okay, we're going to move on now. Talked about the skill of knowledge and application. And if you weren't as strong as you might have wanted to have been on the identifying the famous economists, then you've got a chance to redeem yourself here. On slide number 8, there is a map. If you've got a print out of this, you'll be able to print or use that map. If you haven't got a print out of that and you've got access to a map at the moment, maybe on another device or on paper, then that's going to be fantastic, because I'm going to ask you to make some marks on your map. And those marks are going to be based on a series of questions that I've got for you. And we're going to look at a sort of an international element of economics. We're going to look at economic hotspots around the world. So hopefully you're going to have a moment to get yourself a map, even if it was just one that you could see so that you could notionally point yourself where. Okay, so we're going to do some economic hotspots. On your map, I'd like you to mark the following for me, please. First off, number 1, can you pause this slide in between each one of these while you puzzle out where it is you're going to put your mark on your map? Number 1, can you, on your map, point out the country that voted for Brexit? Now, if you are using my map, you'll notice that it is not London-centric, it is Pacific-centric. And the reason for that is we have a very particular view on the world, and we view the world with us sat in the middle. And in terms of time zones and the Greenwich Meridian, that makes some sense. But if you're an economist in lots of other countries in the world, there's no way that you would think that that is the centre of the world. You would think where you lived is the centre of the world. And this map in itself helps with that understanding of that concept. So hopefully you've marked the country that voted for a Brexit. If not, have a go at marking that country now. Next up, the BRICS countries. Pause this slideshow. Each one of those letters represents a country. B, R, I, C, and S. Can you mark on your map the BRICS? Next up is the region of the world where most of the less developed countries are. Whereabouts on this map would you point to if you were asked where the most underdeveloped economies in the world could be found? Next up, hopefully you've heard of the Great Depression. They should be capitalised in this sentence, shouldn't they? It is the Great Depression. The Great Depression that started in 1929, not any more recent ones that you might be familiar with. Can you mark on your map where that started? Next up, can you mark the country that has the highest proven oil reserves? Where in the world will we find that? And finally, can you mark the country that takes money off their savers for saving? Where in the world is there a negative interest rate? Okay, when you've done all of that, move yourself onto the next slide. On the next slide, we're going to go through the answers, okay? Okay, so let's see how you did now. First off, marking on your map the country that voted for a Brexit. We are right in the very final stages of negotiating whatever Brexit deal there will be with the EU. Hopefully somewhere over here, if you can see my clicker, you've marked the UK in the top left of this diagram. Next up, the BRICS. Countries that make up the BRICS are Brazil. Brazil's going to be over on this side of your diagram. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Yeah, that's our Latin America. So hopefully you've got this huge country down here marked as Brazil on the map. Russia is this huge broad one all the way across the top here. That's B and R. Next up is I for India. Hopefully you've got India marked here on your map. China, this huge country next to India and underneath Russia there. And finally S for South Africa, down here on the bottom of the African Cape Peninsula. So those are the different countries that make up the BRICS. Next up, the region of the world where most of our less developed countries are. In fact, If you put any kind of mark all the way along the very middle of the world, that might be traditionally what you learned in primary school, a difficult place for economies to thrive. But if you want definitely the least developed economies of the world, you're looking across this central belt of sub-Saharan Africa. Next up, the starting place of the Great Depression in 1929. You're back over on the right-hand side of the diagram now. You should be somewhere down the right-hand side of the United States, just in there somewhere, with Wall Street in New York. The country with the highest proven oil reserves in the world is Venezuela. So from there, we are going to go south to the northern coastline of Latin America this time. And we've got this country, my mouse disappears over there. There it is. Venezuela down there, and finally the country that takes money off savers for saving at the moment, negative interest rate, is Japan. And this is Japan out in the Pacific Ocean over in the middle of the map. So those are our economic hotspots. Let me just show you some of the least developed economies in the world on our map. As I said, you can see them centered around particularly this middle band of Africa. This is where your work as an economist potentially can have the most impact on people in the future. And that may be with you not leaving the UK at all. A lot of the work we do is about the sustainability of humans on our planet. Longer term, what decisions might we make now that would in the future help these people who struggle to do better, to have more money, to have higher incomes, to move themselves out of the sorts of poverty that they live in at the moment. And as an economist, that would definitely be one job that you might end up doing. Okay, next up we're going to do some economics in the news. I'm going to get you to compare your limited knowledge of economics based on what I've taught you so far with your wider knowledge of what goes on in the economy. So we're going to, first off, we're going to look at recessions. Okay, I'm going to give you an image, a graph. I'll explain the graph, and then I'm going to ask you to make some responses to questions that I've written about this. So here is a graph, and it shows album sales in the UK in terms of numbers of millions of albums from 1972 through to 2008. Okay, on top of that, you've got the purple, pinky purple line, and that shows gross domestic product in the UK. That's our best way of measuring how well the UK's economy is doing. If that gross domestic product, which is a measure of all the goods and services we produce, is increasing, if it's getting bigger, then our economy is doing better. If it's on its way down, our economy is shrinking. And what you can see across the course of this graph is, as music sales, which is the bar lines, increase and decrease, so there are some definite correlations with what's going on in terms of general music sales. So use this chart to answer the questions on the following slide. Why are music sales likely to be quite a good way of measuring the strength of an economy? Pause this slideshow now and write your thoughts down for that question. Next up, what limitations are there in using music sales to represent an economy? Go back to the graph if you need to. Not all the times when music sales are really strong is the economy doing well. And not all the times when the economy starts to do badly, do music sales do badly straight away. So why might that link break down at certain times? Write down your answer now. Next up, why do we stop the graph in 2008? And I have deliberately stopped it, particularly by the end of the graph. The music sales in terms of albums seems to be losing its link with what's going on in the economy. Why do you think that might be? If we did carry on the graph until 2019, particularly mapping how well the economy is doing, what is it that you think that we might see? This is your forecasting ability we're looking at now. Have a go at writing your response. And finally, what's different about unemployment in the more recent recession that we had? The 2008-2009 recession, it was unusual in terms of unemployment, the number of people out of work. If you think you know why, write down your answer now. Okay, I'm going to talk through some of the responses that you might have written for these. These aren't the right answers or the best answers. They're just things that you might have thought about. So first off, why music sales are a good way of measuring the strength of the economy. We would think of music sales, buying music, as a bit of a luxury. People spend money on luxuries when they feel relatively wealthy, when they feel like they've got money that they can spend on more than just the basics in life. Music, though, it's quite strongly linked to people feeling they've got money, because it's one of the more important things that people buy. Or when I say more important, it's something that people, when they've got money, they definitely like to buy early. So music sales relate relatively strongly to how well the economy is doing. If the economy starts to boom, music sales generally would increase. There might be some limitations in music sales representing the overall economy, though. It may be that people actually decide, you know what, I haven't got much money at the minute, but I am going to carry on buying my music because I enjoy it. It may be that different influences, what we watch on telly, programs like The X Factor, drive increases in music sales, even at a time when the economy might not be doing quite as well as we would like. Also, we tend to find these days that even when we have a recession, and even though that might have some quite catastrophic consequences for lots of people, compared to our grandparents and our great-grandparents, recessions don't affect us quite as strongly. People may carry on buying music a little bit more than they used to. Why might we stop the graph in 2008? Well, there are a few things going on there. First off, we've got a sudden and large drop in GDP, as you can see there. The main reason, though, would be because music sales by that time had already changed. People were a lot less likely to be buying albums. People started using Spotify, people watch their music on YouTube, you can subscribe to Apple, you can buy your music from Amazon now. And people who do that, particularly these days, are a lot more likely to buy individual songs than albums, which is what people would have bought before. And you can see by looking at the end of the graph that music sales are already moving away from the strength of the economy as a good indicator, whereas in the past they definitely were a strong indicator. If we carried on the graph until 2019, the GDP figure, you would see that big drop in 2008 and 9 before a slow recovery. And the slow recovery would have taken the economy roughly to where it was in around about 2007, 2008. And then in 2019, we would just be beginning to move back beyond where the economy was previously. 2020 has been a very different year, and you probably have some idea of what would have happened to those charts, those bars, particularly in 2020. What's different about unemployment? I've put in this recession, I'm talking about the most recent recessions, the big one we would look at, 2008, 2009, 2010. And the different thing about those was, compared to previous recessions, the number of people losing their jobs was definitely smaller. People don't tend to lose their jobs in recessions as much as they did before. That might reflect the fact that people do more part-time work, that people are on 0 hours contracts. So rather than lose their jobs, they just take less hours, or their employer gives them less hours. It also reflects the fact that a lot more people now work as mini entrepreneurs. They make their own income themselves from selling things. Hopefully, as an economist, you would put yourself in good stead in terms of being somebody who's able to be relatively recession-proof with your employment. Okay, we're going to move on to a completely different bit of economics now. So, keeping the strand of recessions, but thinking about the government and what the government's role in all of this is, have a look at the next slide. Next up, we're going to do tax receipts. Have a look, please, at the slide again. You should now be on your second column. Tax receipts are the different places that the government gets its money from. And again, I want you to try and write down the names of the taxes that you know of. What are the 5 or 6 main taxes that the government has to raise the money for all the spending that you've just made a list of? And again, when you've done that, can you number them? 1, where is the most financially significant place that the government gets its tax revenue from? through to number 4, 5 or 6, depending on how many you get. Have a go at that now. Okay, hopefully you didn't see when I suddenly flicked the slide on a minute ago some of the answers. Let's have a look at some of them now. Let's see where the government is spending its money. So first off, I should say that this is from 2018. And this report is produced by the government. These figures are obviously rounded, and therefore they don't completely add up to the overall figure that you might get. But have a look at this. Our government's biggest bit of spending, even in times that aren't affected by global pandemics, is social protection, social security, payments to people who are either unable to pay for themselves through illness, through lack of having a job, through not being able to work through disability, people who are of pensionable age. That's the biggest bit of government spending. Next up is health, 166 billion. The health service in itself, all the things that sit alongside that to keep people healthy. Education is next on 103 billion, and I shan't read through all the rest of them. What I will say is defence at 52 billion is probably quite a bit smaller than most students tend to think if they had it on their list at all. And after that 52 billion and the other, which includes our EU transactions, which will suddenly shrink by quite a large amount, we have this net debt interest. Every year at the moment, our government spends around about £40 billion paying off its debts. Money that it owes to people that it's borrowed money from to be able to do this spending. And if you think the entire budget for transport in the UK is 37 billion, if we didn't have to pay the interest on all of our debts, that would be a huge amount of money that our economy would have to spend elsewhere. Okay, next up is government revenue. These are the main taxes. Income tax is the country's biggest tax. You've probably got that one as first, hopefully, 193 billion. Next up is VAT. Everything that we buy, except for our absolute essentials like bread and milk, you're going to pay VAT on that. Even somebody your age is paying tax on everything they buy, and that brings our government about 156 billion pounds a year. National insurance is next. For those of you that work, you'll be used to having some of those contributions beginning to be taken off you. You should be able to claim most of them back, especially if you earn less than around about £12,000 a year. You should be claiming nearly all of your tax back. You might have paid some national insurance contributions though, and they total 142 billion. Some people think that that's used specifically for the NHS, and it doesn't work quite so straightforward. Basically, all of that money goes into the government pot, and the government then allocates money to the different departments. So it's not that national insurance specifically pays for the NHS, but clearly it goes towards it. Some of the main taxes that you may have written down: corporation tax on businesses. We've got excise duties, duties paid on imports and exports from the UK. You've got council taxes, and then lots of other ones that you might have in your other taxes are likely to include stamp duty when people move house, but not at the minute. Car tax, inheritance tax, they're all likely to sit in there. Okay, here's what I'd like you to do next. I need you to add up all of the spending that the government do from the previous slide, and you might need to go backwards to do that and get yourself a total. Then I need you to add up all the revenue that the government get from this current slide and get yourself a total. Then I need you to work out the difference in those two totals. Get yourself a percentage difference, please. And then I want you to tell me, does that mean that our government has a deficit or a debt for this particular year, which, as I said, was 2018? And if it does, how big is that debt? Okay, so let's check your answers for that working out. Overall, in terms of total government spending, I think you should have a figure of £841 billion for 2018. For taxation, for tax revenue, the government brought in around about £811 billion. Overall, that means that the government spends about 4% more than it generates in taxes, a difference of around about 30 billion for 2018. That will be a £30 billion deficit for that year. That means the government has to borrow £30 billion in 2018 to cover all the spending that it's done. We would call that the government budget deficit. If you take the deficit for 2018, which was 30 billion, and you add it to all the previous deficits, so the one from 2017 and 16, and our government has for a number of years now spent more than it's brought in taxes, you will have the overall government debt figure. And that debt figure at the moment for us is probably not worth even thinking about, other than to say that somebody has to pay it off. And therefore, that interest that we saw on our previous slide, that's the money that the government spends paying down its overall debt. Okay, last little bit for our lesson today. We're going to move on to individuals. Rather than looking at the economy overall, we're going to think about individuals and their behaviours. Having looked at the economy overall being macroeconomics, this is going to be a bit of microeconomics. So, influencing people's behaviour. Sorry, excuse me. Can I ask you please on your list, on your page, sorry, to write down one final list from, well, actually it's probably the second last list. Can you write down a list of things that people do which are bad for them or for the people around them? What do people in our country do that is not good for them? Write those down in your list. Pause this slideshow whilst you do that. On the next slide, I've got some ideas of the sorts of things that I think you might have written, and we're going to have a think about them for a few minutes. So, having made a list of, oops, let me skip through that. I'll look at those. Okay, so let's have a look then at solutions, economic solutions that prevent or reduce people doing things that are bad for them. Hopefully you've got some of these on your list. First off, if things are really bad as a country, we might make them illegal. If they are a little bit bad and that means that we think that you need to be a bit older to make a sensible decision about them, then we might make them illegal for people of a certain age. We put warnings on things that are bad for people. Cigarettes is the obvious one, but most alcohol these days has a warning on the packet. You can't buy very many foods without some warning on the packet. You'll notice a red label on the front of anything that you buy that's unhealthy, that's sugary, as a health warning to discourage you from having too much of it. Another way is to put taxes on things. We discourage consumption by placing taxes on things that are bad for people. We have adverts that tell people not to do it. I was listening to music this morning on Spotify and there was an advert on there telling me not to do something that was bad for me and bad for those around me. Quite often the government will take action to try and make alternatives cheaper or sometimes even free. We might want to make sure that we can make things available for people so that they have a healthy alternative to the thing that they are doing that's bad for them. So if you want to give up smoking, smoking's an expensive habit, you can get Nicorette patches, you can get those on the NHS, the government will pay towards them to help you reduce your consumption of them. Things like litter. We have bin collections, you would take them for granted. But somebody somewhere at some point has decided if we don't go and collect this from people's houses, it's going to be everywhere. So why don't we weekly go and collect all this, bring it in and sort it out ourselves? And the final one is a much more recent phenomenon. Social shaming. People who do things that other people disagree with, they're much more likely these days to be shamed on social media. There aren't that many things anymore that you might do that are bad for you, that somebody somewhere won't be saying, don't do that, why are you doing that? Social shaming is our new way of discouraging people from doing things that they shouldn't be doing. As an economist, you will use a combination of these different tactics to support people in the UK and all over the world to make healthier, wiser decisions so that everybody ends up better off. That really is the end of our economics lesson for today. As I said, we have gone through a relatively large amount of different content. Hopefully you found some of that interesting, and if you have, hopefully we will see you in an economics class in the new academic year. We are fantastic as a school at generating outstanding results for young people. So if you're prepared to enjoy the content that we've discovered, and you're prepared to learn the different things that we've talked about, then you are prepared to be a really effective future economist. Hopefully, we'll see you all soon.